Authors are influenced by other writers, right? It's not the professors standing up at the front of the class who are deciding what's important, right? We're merely acknowledging what the authors are recognizing as important.
My name is Matt Wincherauk, and I am the sports editor at the Carillon. And today I am here with, I'm going to be doing a book interview with Dr. Susan Johnston. And she and another U of R professor, Jess Battis, did a nice book, a collection of essays called Mastering the Game of Thrones. And I think this is really interesting because we, obviously Game of Thrones has taken off in popularity, and clearly it's very popular here because we have the classes, we had the Martin class, and we have other classes that Jess Battis actually taught with, that feature the books as well. So I think this should be good. I think we have a lot of interest here. So what inspired you to actually do all of this? Like, so why is it important that we understand the Game of Thrones so in depth?
Well, two reasons, maybe three, really. And only the last one is it goes to popularity. The really exciting thing about being in this business, which is the business of literature, is that every now and then you're kind of going along your business and you're teaching your this and that and the other thing, and you're reading, and you suddenly realize that you're reading something that is changing literature. And, you know, most of the time we're looking backwards, right? We're saying, oh yeah, this guy Shakespeare came along and that was a pretty big deal. And we now understand that he changed things in these important ways. Now, I'm not comparing Martin to Shakespeare, but I'm saying that there are certain moments, right, where a book comes along and it's doing something new, or it's doing something old in a new way, and everything around it kind of shifts because authors are influenced by other writers, right? It's not the professors standing up at the front of the class who are deciding what's important, right? We're merely acknowledging what the authors are recognizing as important. But after a while, you get so you can feel it happening, if that makes sense. Tolkien was like this. Tolkien wrote his Lord of the Rings, and then we had there was fantasy before Tolkien, and there was fantasy after Tolkien. But fantasy after Tolkien is different because it is everybody who writes fantasy reads Lord of the Rings, and that changes the way they write. Well, George R. R. Martin comes along, he's doing A Song of Ice and Fire, and there's always been realist elements in fantasy. There have always been historical elements to greater or lesser degree in fantasy, but the kind of gritty medievalism, but that's still shot through with that kind of belief in goodness, I guess, that characterizes the Tolkienian fantasy is still present. That's different, right? The detail is different. The scope is different. And I read Game of Thrones and I kind of put it down, and I could feel everything shifting around it. So I think it's important because it's pointing us to something new that's happening in the way people write and read right now. That's reason one. Reason two is that it points us, because of the way Martin writes, because he seems to have read everything and integrated everything, he lets us revisit literary tradition and say, oh, these guys that we thought weren't important anymore, because nobody read them. Don Quixote, who cares about that, right? Chaucer, oh no, we don't need that because we have movies now, right? Beowulf, nobody cares. We realize, reading Martin, that they still do matter quite a lot. So he makes what used to be called the canon new for us again. And I think that's really vital.
Right. So one of the essays talks about kind of like the history of Game of Thrones and where it draws stuff from, like from our history. So can you talk a little bit about like some of the direct influences, stuff like The Wall, The Red Wedding, and The Clash of Five Kings, for example?
Sure. One of the things I love about Martin is that he seems to have read everything. And the worst mistake you can make as a Martin scholar is thinking, well, I'll just read everything Martin read and then I will, know all and understand all. You can't. You can't do that and have a life. I don't know how he has read everything he has read. But there are some great stories around his influence. It's helpful to think of Westeros, and there's a chapter in the book actually that disagrees with this, that talks about it as, says, you know, the underestimated influence is the American frontier and that experience. That's Mikhail Zontos' piece, which talks about, you know, Turner's frontier thesis and the way it pushes west and talks about the wildlings belong the wall. But for most, and that's an important essay and worth reading because of the way it talks about our encounter with the wilderness. But for most readers, Westeros is a kind of big stretched out Britain that goes far, far north of where Scotland actually ends up and goes far, far south of where Devon and the kind of south bit of England actually ends up. But it's kind of like that, and it has something like approximating its history, if its history ran from the far Nordic countries, Greenland, all the way to Mediterranean Spain, yep. Right? Turkey, that kind of area. And the wall, the real world, primary world analog is Hadrian's Wall. They said, so Martin had never seen Hadrian's Wall in person before he wrote the books. And apparently his first reaction was, I made it too big. Because Hadrian's Wall is not actually that high, right? Yeah. 700 feet is enormous, right? But he was visiting the kind of mock-up they built for the show, and looking at the CGI and stuff, and he visited the actual wall. I made it too big. And that's one of the things, right? Fantasy takes these kind of moments. The Red Wedding is people say Martin's so brutal. He can always point to a historical analog. Black Banquet, I think it's called.
Yeah, something like that.
Feuding Scottish clans. Yeah. And under cover of truce, right? The laird brings in his former enemies, now allies, and has them disarmed and murders them to a man. That's pretty dark. Yeah. You know, there's the stain on the name of Campbell to this day. Or one of the things I think that's so important about Martin's use of history, and so interesting about Martin's use of history, is he makes the past live for us again, right? The writer Tina Melville, who writes sort of gothic horror fantasy, calls this the literalization of the metaphor. The dragon always stands for something in fantasy. If you're Tina Melville, it usually stands for like rampaging capitalism, for example. But it's also always a dragon, right? So the Red Wedding points us to the Black Banquet, right? It points us to that feuding past of the Scottish clans and shows us, in fact, the way their kind of brokenness, their inability to unite, their fighting amongst themselves, made them totally vulnerable to English domination. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that past takes on a new life and new meanings in the context of the world that he builds, right? So the Clash of the Five Kings is very powerfully reminiscent of the Wars of the Roses, right? And I think it's Jessica Walker in the book, terrific article, brings in Shakespeare and historiography and ideas of luck and fortune. But she's talking about Shakespeare's War of the Roses plays, right? She's talking about his Henriade, talking about the ways that incorporation of history in the work of art makes history new again, right? And also reveals to us disputable meanings, sure, but meanings of history that we may not always be thinking about when we think of it as the dead past that we can bury.